there are a couple quotes I wanted to ask you about to at least get your take on them, about what you make of them. One of them is what Jeff Passan said on Brock and Salk on Friday. The exact quote, at least what Jeff said, was, inside of that clubhouse, and he said this dates back years, there were issues that just never got resolved, and there were players who were never on board with them. Like, I guess I was always under the impression that he was pretty well received service in that clubhouse, but at least from what Jeff makes it sound like, maybe that wasn't always the case. Like, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the thing is, though, how many people are around from a few years ago, honestly?
Right.
I mean, like,
right.
they cycle out so many players off and on, so it's like, you know, J.P. Crawford likes Scott. I mean, him and Scott were guys. He's been around the longest. Then you have Dylan Moore and Mitch Haniger, the next longest, and they were there for some of the earlier issues with Scott. Like, this is the problem with, and it's more of a narrative, and maybe, you know, but we couldn't really write it the way to debunk it a little bit, but in a lot of the players' minds, and it goes back to the Mather situation and all that, when the Mather stuff comes out, and everything else, and all this other stuff is going on, it's Jerry represented that faction, you know, the front office. So players don't, you know, and they didn't trust him. But, you know, because of the narrative that Scott does anything and everything that Jerry says, then they don't trust Scott because they just think he's an extension of Jerry. You know what I mean? Like, they thought, oh yeah, Scott's just Jerry's puppet. Well, I think as over the years have gone on, that's not necessarily the case, in the sense that, like, Scott and Jerry aren't the best of friends anymore. Well, they're definitely not now, probably, but you know, that relationship was distanced a little bit. I mean, if your best friend, okay, look at you two. If one of you becomes the other person's boss for 9 years, and then, like, tells you what to do, makes you wear all your, you know, the boss makes a mistake, but the other guy has to go out and wear it every day, and you don't get to make a lot of decisions, and, like, you know, he controls how much money you make and all that other stuff. Yeah, there's going to be a split, a fracture, and it's going to distance themselves. I mean, I've heard Scott and Jerry yelling at each other, you know, post game. You know, Scott's mad because of the players, that Jerry's, you know, because Scott doesn't have any, like, no manager has influence on the roster anymore. They can have influence, but they don't get a say. You know, GMs now and presidents hold the ultimate power. It's not set up before, but, like, they're not. This isn't like Moneyball where you got to go trade a player so the manager doesn't play him. You know, they all run it. So it's like, I just think it's a difference, and I think the players don't necessarily understand that either. There's a distrust of the front office for all that went down earlier, you know, and other stuff. And they look at Jerry as the representative of the front office and the decision making on, you know, players you acquire, players you don't, or whatever. And then by extension, because Scott is still so affiliated with Jerry, that they don't, you know, there's a distrust. You know, they don't have that maybe separation where it's the manager and the guys in the clubhouse versus the front office. No, they viewed Scott more as a guy that was so close to the front office, which I don't necessarily know that's true, but it's also because, like, how they play and how the decision making is made, you know, in terms of having the analysts, having, you know, the input from Jerry and Justin, and having, you know, how the style of baseball, whether it's the platooning, you know, the kind of the building out their boards and their red, green, yellow for relievers on who you want to go with, the pockets and all that stuff, which, you know, this is common with almost every team now. They do this all. I mean, like, everybody collaborates together to make the decision process. You know, it's not just one guy out there, well, you know what, my gut feels like he can, you know. It's like, it's not Lou Brown in Major League. Oh, you know, I know Vaughn's struggled with this guy, but I got a feeling he's due. You know, like, we don't see that. And then, like, the gaffes, you know, the Robbie Ray in the postseason and stuff like that. There's stuff like that, you know. But even, like, with Haniger, you know, he was one of those guys that I think came around a little more on Scott from being where he was, and then Scott came in and everything, because I think Scott tried really hard to impose his will early on, and I think he realized that doesn't work, you know, and I think and I kind of wrote this, through the failures of his own playing career and everything else, he realized that you got to let people be who they are and then try and work within the framework of that. And I think that was important and it got better. But some of the people that were still there and the remnants of friends were gone and everything else, it's like, that's another thing. It's like, you get rid of my friend on the team, you get rid of this guy that I work with, this trainer, this coach, this whatever staffer, you get rid of him. Well, I don't like you because you hurt my friend. I mean, like, I even told Scott that one time. I said, there are a lot of people that want to see you fail because how, Jerry and others, Jerry specifically, how he treated. Like, they fired a bunch of the scouting staff, fired coaches and stuff like that. So it was like, I think that was the reason why there is that kind of distrust, because there's still a segment of players based on narrative and based on how they do things that always felt that, like, Scott and Jerry were so tight instead of Scott being on his own island.
I think the other thing I was curious to ask you about too, before we get to some more of the Dan Wilson stuff, is just to start to wrap up on Scott here a little bit, is maybe we read too much into this, but I guess the quote Julio gave you guys the other day, and specifically the difference between him and JP's, because when JP was asked about Servais, and you just mentioned it, he really likes Scott, and he said, "You taught me how to be myself on the field. I think that's really changed my career." And then Julio's quote, he gave this to Daniel Kramer. He said, "I'm just kind of focused on playing baseball. That's a higher up decision. We're employees, so I just have to go out and play every day." Now, are we reading too much into that quote, or was it a little wishy-washy?
Maybe. I mean, I'm not going to say you're wearing a tinfoil hat and looking for conspiracy theories, but I mean, I think players just move forward. I think they just move forward. Like, if somebody gets fired, it's like, okay, yeah, this sucks. Gotta go. It's, really, Julio's dealing with enough stuff on his own right now to kind of focus on it. So I don't know that in that, the context of it all, I was kind of there for some of the comments. It was more, Julio was just trying to get ready to go, and it was clear, a lot of guys just didn't want to talk about it. I mean, in their minds too, they know in the back, we sucked, so he got fired. It's the second guy that lost their job because we can't hit, and he's at the forefront of the players that are supposed to hit that isn't hitting. So they weren't, Haniger didn't want to really dwell on it. He'd say some things, and then, JP and Scott had a different relationship than a lot of the other players. But, somebody like Victor Robles, who in 2 months really loved Scott for allowing him to be who he was, whereas a DC, not so much. So, I don't know. I mean, do you ever really truly love your boss? You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't think that there was this dislike for Julio for Scott, but I know Scott is hard on Julio. People may not think it, and because he doesn't blow people up on the field or in the media, but I know I've heard and I saw more than a couple times where Scott's brought Julio into his office because he was unhappy with something that was going on the field, or his approach. I mean, he has been as critical of Julio as probably any player about his approach. Stuff he talked about not being ready to hit, all this kind of stuff. So I mean, I'm sure Julio doesn't like that, but I also don't think he reads it either. So I mean, I don't. I think they just all moved on. I mean, even as upset as they were about Kendall Graveman being traded that day, or Paul Sewell being traded, 2 days later they moved on, because that's what they do. They learn to forget real quick.